Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here. I'm excited to be here with you all and with my esteemed panelists. So with me, we have Keith Busby, the acting CISO at CMS, Anil Chaudhry, the Senior Advisor for AI at the Department of Transportation, and Chris Saunders, the Worldwide Director of Public Sector Solutions Engineering at Wiz. Thank you so much for being here with us. So you all are leading the charge when it comes to implementing AI as it relates to cybersecurity, and I'm excited to dive more into some of those different uses that you're seeing and how that tech is evolving and shifting the cyber landscape. So as we know, AI is both bolstering our ability to defend against threats, but adversaries are using it at the same time for their own advantage. So we'll talk more about how agencies are deploying AI to enhance detection, automate response, and strengthen resilience, while also confronting some of the new risks that we're seeing. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with you, Keith. AI is changing the landscape, so what feels most urgent to you right now, and where are agencies still underestimating risks?
So I think the important thing to keep in mind, and you already touched on this, is that our adversaries are already using it. Mm-hmm. So we are inherently behind the curve, right? We have to deal with policy changes, we have to deal with regulation changes, we have to deal with funding implications, and they can just go do it. Mm-hmm. So we need to pick up the pace, right? We're already in a game of catch up, so we need to look at how we can rapidly layer this into our processes. For CMS, we've already been exploring, keeping the human in the middle of the decision factor, but how we can layer it into our processes to help speed up our decision making, help normalize data, help highlight data insights, so that we can start to make these decisions at a quicker pace.
That makes sense. And Neil, I'll turn it over to you. What, when we talk about AI and cybersecurity, is most urgent, or what are you prioritizing?
So before I answer that question, I'm sorry, take this off script just for a second, is that, folks are probably, some of them are wondering, hey, Neil, you're on the talking circuit. What's going on? Are you planning to leave federal government anytime soon? And the short answer is no. It was just a confluence of events with the federal shutdown and everything that some of these speaking things got rejiggered. But no, I am on the circuit, but I'm not leaving. But with that being said, piggybacking off exactly what you said is the pace of change, where, all of us are very familiar, those of us who grew up in the industry, about, 18 months with Moore's Law and things like that. Every 3 years, you update your infrastructure stack. But with artificial intelligence, that cycle has moved to 7 months. So how do you adapt your organization to upgrade every 7 months? Because the level of cognition that these foundational AI models provide doubles every 7 months. So, and with that, risk also doubles every 7 months. How do you adapt quickly so that your governance doesn't become a risk factor in itself? Thank you.
Yeah, so Chris, I'll turn it over to you. How can agencies make sure governance doesn't become a risk in itself, or prioritize some of those risks?
Yeah, I think the key is, how do you understand what you're assessing? I think if I think back early in my career, I was at Homeland Security and we were building out one of the first data centers out in Ashburn. And literally my job at that time was to go around and tag the servers, put a sticker on them and do inventory. And that is obviously very human error prone, very slow, very manual. So literally our inventory systems have been that way for many, many years. Now we're in this area of cloud, and we really have a hard time understanding what's out there, what's deployed. And we shouldn't, because industry should leverage the APIs from the cloud providers. You should be able to see everything that's out there. So the first thing that I think the agencies need to do is understand what is out there to assess for risk. And we should be able to provide an inventory of any technology, including AI, the models, the orchestration, the agents, all those things. So understanding that baseline of what we have is the key to assessing risk for any system. And from there, you begin to start to prioritize against that inventory. So that's sort of how we see the world.
In case you were curious, tagging assets is still a problem.
I didn't want to say it out loud, but thank you for validating, Keith, because I figured it's still a challenge.
Yeah, and Keith, you mentioned this in your opening question, but you're using AI to improve how you're viewing data, improve the speed. So could you dive a bit deeper into some of the ways that you're using AI and seeing
Sure.
this as
So
operational?
one of the first areas we took a look at was what manual tasks do we have to still do, and how could we use it to help automate that? So we're layering it in our SOC capabilities, right? Helping do initial reviews around what alerts that are coming in, right? Alert fatigue is a real thing. We need to take some of this load off of our SOC analysts. We don't have enough of them as it is. We brought it in to help evaluate our data pipelines, help correlate and normalize data streams so that we can make better decisions based off of the data feeds that we're bringing in. We are looking at it from an assessment standpoint, from a governance standpoint, right? Generating the SAPs, the security assessment report, or the plan and the reports is still very much a manual thing. Can we feed these models a bunch of data and have it formulate these plans of assessment for us? And then how can we help automate that assessment plan? We're using it from a vulnerability management standpoint, normalizing vulnerabilities, right? I think recent changes in the AI industry are gonna rapidly throw vulnerabilities at every technical entity. And as a whole, we're not ready to handle that. We're already buried into it. So we need to use this technology to help us prioritize those vulnerabilities that we're working on. We're looking at it from pen test standpoint, right? While we have a bug bounty program, we're going to use these things to help us take some of the load off of the junior assessors, run some of these scanning activities, and see what it can do for us.
So when you're looking to see what it can do for you, what are some of the early lessons learned from using AI in operations?
One, keep the human in the loop. Two, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Fail fast, but learn fast as well. Deploy it, experiment. I think that is a little bit different than what the government is used to doing. Failing fast and rapid experimentation is not something that we have always been great at. So I think we're learning as it goes along how we can just continue to test and fail, and it's okay to fail. I think that in itself is a success.
Right, that's true. And Chris, I'll turn it over to you. So we've talked a little bit about data tagging, the challenges around visibility. How can industry help provide visibility into some of these modern environments when we're talking about AI?
Yeah, I think it goes back to like, what do you have and how do you understand the risks there? So if you think about introducing any technology, the way you prioritize what you focus on is super important. So, one example I have of this is I was vibe coding using something called Gemini, and I wanted to build an app in the cloud, and the AI could not get past a policy that our company had put in place and couldn't understand why, and then it would still get around it somehow and literally deploy insecure configurations, and essentially allowed this AI agent access to an S3 bucket from anywhere in the world. So being able to prioritize risk with multiple factors is critical for our customers versus traditionally when we've looked at assessing risk, we look at through CVEs, through CVE scores. There's much more context you need to really understand how you prioritize things, including AI, because developers are going to use software development kits that have CVEs. They're going to use those in workloads in the cloud, and they might inadvertently, through vibe coding, expose those to the internet for anyone to get to. So you have to really be able to prioritize that versus someone installed an SDK on a VM behind 8 different firewalls with no exposure to the internet, no other factors of risk. So you really have to be able to prioritize across all those factors to focus on what's important and what leaves you at most risk. So that's how we would advise folks to look at risk, including AI and other technologies. It's really the same principle, regardless if it's AI or 3 years ago when everyone was talking about containers and Kubernetes.
Right, yeah, and Neil,
I was just going to jump in real quick. One of the reasons that we at CMS deployed a CNAP was to help us with that specifically, right? That contextualized risk. I hope that we as an industry can all agree that CVSS scoring is outdated and at this point fairly useless. And there's a lot other risk points that should be considered, whether it's KEV, whether it's EPSS, which is exploitability for those that don't know, the probability aspect. Layering in these other technologies to look at your risk from an outside edge and then also connect how it impacts, I think that is where we need to focus on.
So, one thing I'd like to add is, my background is in like physical supply chain resilience, logistics in the Army and stuff. And those principles are about the same principles in a digital world and in a physical world. And you talked about SDKs and, I see open source packages. Developers out there, they have to get their work done. They have to close out a ticket on, a story or an epic or whatnot, and they're in a rush. They'll just go to the web and they'll just find a open source package that makes their life easier, put it in their chain, but we don't know what's in that package and those dependencies. So how do you build from an organizational standpoint, especially from industry, that process to spot check your open source packages and your dependencies going into products that will eventually support government use, which is a higher risk threshold than, like a MySpace app that just connects, friends.
Right, yeah, that makes sense.
It's actually a really good point. And we've seen recently with these third-party supply chain tags, right, where it's light LLM and trivia, and it's shining a light on a new focus point of the developer laptops and what libraries are using locally versus less just the system security, right? We have visibility into that. Runtime's still a thing that we chase at times, but what's being used downstream before it even gets pushed out is where we have a huge gap in visibility.
Yeah, and the impact of that, right? So you could have, like in that trivia example, you could have someone committed that open source code to GitHub, right? And maybe 300 developers did the same thing. And one of them actually deployed that in runtime. And most scanners, most dev tools will only see that shift left part. Oh, we've got 300 of these vulnerabilities. Which one do we fix first? Well, if you're not scanning both your cloud and your code repos, you're not going to be able to prioritize which one to go first. You want to fix the one that's actually deployed and running in production versus just going through all those 300 and you'll get to them eventually. So it's about that context to help you prioritize that CVE is actually running and we can be exploited right now in our production environment. So that's critical for folks to understand where they're at risk.
So it actually, it points back to that the single greatest risk in any IT system is still the people sitting here, right? It's because all of these supply chain attacks originate from a person being compromised. So, and that's not going to change.
No, and I'd definitely like to add to that, from where I sit and where I work, and a lot of work I do is in the research space looking 2 years out. So, 3 years ago I was talking about agentic AI, now I'm looking at other things. But what we are seeing, in this space, forward-looking space, is that what you think of, with IT development, it's always been very collaborative. People put stuff in open source. You always like to work as teams. You like to contribute to the ecosystem. But this has turned into a nation-state game that you need to be at least aware of, where they are our nation-state adversaries to the United States that are going out there and co-opting standards bodies over the long term, over 3 to 4 years, 5 years. And they'll work up the chain to eventually they become the, somebody on their team becomes the approving authority for a fork or approving, a package to go into production with a vulnerability. And we're starting to see that more and more on simple things like, drive determination, right? All of a sudden there's code in there that was co-opted. We're starting to see more and more examples of that. So as industry, you're looking to see where you get your code, you need to also be more aware of the fact that this open source code may be compromised because of a higher nation state struggle.
Right. And when we talk about managing that risk while still leaving room for innovation, the rise of agentic systems, Neil, I'd like to stick with you for the next one. How can agencies leverage MCP, Model Context Protocol, or?
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic that we're starting to look into, with MCP, because, a lot of us in this field, as we were growing up, eventually we all coalesce around this idea of SDKs or APIs, ways for systems to interact with each other, right? You have a SDK was, these are my set of instructions, how do you build to my system? But the APIs were, how do you connect to my system? In agentic AI with MCP, what it is you have to think about how your AI agents are going to talk to other AI agents. How do you build that governance framework, the MCP, the Model Context Protocol, to make sure your agents are doing the right thing without being ineffective? So, an example would be, authentication. You want some way for your AI agent to authenticate a request from an external AI agent. But you don't want it so cumbersome that your AI agent is sending an alert to a human every 5 seconds, because then you'll get alarm fatigue. So how do you build these instructions? And the reason why this is such an interesting space is if you go to places like Moltbook or others where folks are starting to just let AI agents talk to other AI agents, what you're starting to see is AI agents, when they talk to other agents, don't talk in English. They talk in machine code. They talk in binaries. And it's almost like going into a room, everybody else is speaking French, you're speaking English. You might tell them, hey, I would like you to do this, and the guy in French says, got it, but then when he talks to his buddies, you don't know if they got it, right? Whether he translated your instructions effectively or correctly. So when you look at this, you say, these machines, when you look at that space, they're starting to talk in machine code to each other, and they're starting to have their own syntax, they have their own lingo and whatnot, and you don't know what they're talking about. So how do you build the governance framework that ensures that when you tell your model, do not give out our corporate secrets in this storage unit or in this bucket, right? How do you know that model, your model, is not going to give this, that information to another model because that other model gave them a secret handshake, right? How do you build that infrastructure? But it's stuff to think about now in terms of Model Context Protocol. How are you defining your protocols for your organization that make sure your connections from your AI agents to other AI agents are simple, seamless, secure, and at the end, auditable by a human being? Thank you.
I think it's key, it's almost back to the future. So when we first went into the cloud, the biggest security risk and the unknown for most organizations was identity in the cloud. And when I mean cloud, I mean like cloud infrastructure. Who has access to what server, who has access to what service in Amazon, what can they do? Very different than an on-prem world, where that was very locked down to very few individuals that had the keys to the kingdom. And so it became a challenge for a lot of organizations to manage that, where they would be giving out permissions to things they didn't realize, and folks could do whatever they want in the cloud and access whatever data they want in the cloud. The same thing is repeating with agentic AI. You have to understand the identity access of these agents in your cloud and what they can get to, and then go enforce what they shouldn't get to. You need visibility to understand, is an agent over permissive and able to access a whole bunch of information it probably shouldn't. This is one of the biggest risks that we see when we talk. They don't understand how this is being done. And developers, quite frankly, they're never focused on that. That's not their forte. We always talk about this. I don't think it's because they intentionally do that. They just don't understand exactly what they've done. So I do think you're going to see a world very shortly where some of these, the vibe coding technologies, there's going to be technologies in line of those that are preventing these things from happening and actually pushing out secure, least permissive agents to help like put guardrails around us. But right now, that's not happening. It's kind of Wild West. And it goes back to that key of understanding where are your agentic identities and what do they have access to in your cloud providers. It's key to really understand where you're at risk in terms of AI workloads in the cloud.
And part of that, you know, what you talked about, I'd really like to stress this. I've seen some organizations do a very good job of this. And then some organizations where I've worked in the past is you'll get somebody that talks to me about, oh, you need to secure this data and you need to do this and controls and this. And I look at them and I say, but you're already publishing this data to data.gov. It's already out there. Why are you making me do work to secure it when it's already out there in space? So thinking about your assets, your organizational assets, and saying, what are my crown jewels? What are my secondary, resources that it's okay? It's, and then what are those other tertiary resources that, because I already put it on my website, why am I concerned about cybersecurity for information I put out on my web page? If I put out a data table on my web page, why am I worried about cybersecurity? It's already out there. Mm-hmm. But what are my crown jewels is really the key here, because you can't secure everything. You need to make decisions on what you want to secure. And eventually we'll get to a point where identifying that 5 to 10% of your organization's assets that are critical to your organization's success. And that's the discussion that folks in IT need to be having with the program leads to say, what are your most critical assets? What is it that you absolutely need, in terms of your intellectual property to protect your program? And if it gets out, your program no longer exists, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the discussions IT needs to be having, not so much in terms of, we're going to configure your S3 bucket this way. Yeah, that's important too. But having that discussion, what part of your IP, not just data, but there's other things, what part of your IP is most important to you, and how do we secure that so that we have agents that don't miscommunicate it? Not just data tables, it might be that Word document, it might be that internal PowerPoint file, it might be that analysis you did for a political transition that is somewhere there, that is IP. And you need to figure out what IP you need to protect, what IP actually you need to get rid of so you don't have to protect it anymore. But those sort of discussions in an age of AI, because AI agents don't get tired, they don't get sleepy, they can scale up from 1 to 1,000 in a turn of compute cycle. So all those things you need to think about. Sorry, I went on.
It's part of securing that, right? I think right now, sometimes our answer is going to be, we're not sure. Right? And we can't necessarily hold back innovation on that, because we're going to be playing catch up throughout this entire life cycle of agentic.
Mm-hmm. Right, and Keith, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion was our biggest risk is you all right here. And I've heard more talk about shadow AI, but really it's just shadow IT.
We're creating a new term for a problem that's existed for decades. Right? It's still just shadow IT.
Right.
We haven't been able to, as an industry, I feel like you're going to disagree with that, which I'm excited for. No.
Oh, yeah.
As an industry, we've been struggling with that for decades, right? Getting visibility into what people are doing, and they usually go outside of our boundary to do stuff. Not out of willful ignorance. It's because we've been too constrictive. We put up too many barriers for them to get through. Developers, business people, they have their own needs that need to be met, right? Yes, we want to say that security should be at the table, helping them make decisions. That's true, but we can't be blockers in that decision, right? It's a negotiation. You need this, we need this. Let's find somewhere in the middle to get to.
Right, and
No, I was gonna not
Disagree with you.
disagree with you. I'm actually agreeing, but I've been IT adjacent my whole career, so I feel the frustration, right? I mean, these enterprise things, a CISO's job is one of the hardest, because when they're doing a good job, nobody hears about it. When they're doing a bad job, everybody hears about it, right? So it's a very difficult space. And then there are degrees of things where, like with CMS, there's patient data, there's, in addition to PII, there's PHI, and then there's, proprietary financial data because of, right? So there's a lot of different types of data that's, CISO is, I'm amazed your CISO is still, that organization still functioning.
I don't have any hair.
Right? But in terms of, what we're talking about, shadow AI and governance, the reason why I was like maybe splitting the hair on shadow IT versus shadow AI is I had a young student that interned for me about 2 years ago, and we had this situation where the data tables were locked down. He couldn't print, he couldn't do anything with it, and it was just like a nightmare for him to try to do his job, because sometimes what you need to do is pull the data down, put it in a pivot table. He took out his phone, he took a picture of what was on his screen, and with his private AI, subscription, he recreated that table and emailed it to himself.
Oh.
Right? So all of a sudden, we don't even know that something happened, that somebody took the, internal proprietary, really interesting agency data out of the agency by taking a photo with a camera, and they didn't have to do anything more. It took 2 clicks, and they had an email spreadsheet that was on their screen now in their personal email box.
Wow.
And that's the kind of thing where you say, the technology is so powerful, how do we prevent people from wanting to take that shortcut because our IT staff is so rigid in their frameworks? We could have just as easily given that individual, spun up a virtual machine and let them do what they needed to do in a virtual machine, right? But it just became a harder discussion.
Right.
So I look at frameworks as the spirit of the word, not the written word, right? Because the spirit of the framework is to find a place to secure that asset, but also meet the business need, right? And if we look at if we take it by the written word specifically, you become inflexible. And so frameworks, there's all types of frameworks out there. And I think we just need to look at it for the spirit of them and not what they actually dictate us to do.
I'd really love to hear the industry perspective on this, because all our industry partners, right, they have to follow some rigid framework in order to get paid, and they're probably sometimes telling us why. And I'd really love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I mean, we have the same problem you're describing internally. I have a team of engineers, and there is sanctioned ways to do things with AI, and there are things that we shouldn't do with AI. We don't have, just in the interesting transition we're in, you would think we'd have access to all the latest and greatest AI, but because of the nature of the data we have of our customers, we don't, for very good reasons. So we're telling, hey, leverage AI, do this. They're like, but I can't do this or this because I don't have access to this data. So it's a hard problem to solve, because we all see the benefits of AI in our personal lives, and we're like, why can't we do that at work? There's good reasons, but there has to be a middle ground, right? And we're getting there. We're going to offer like a platform where folks can develop on and leverage AI in the right way, and it's got the right permissions, and we thought very carefully through it. But like from an industry perspective, I mean, it does go back to like, you have to understand what your employees are doing. In the scenario you described, I don't know if there's a way to understand that. And that is the challenge we have. This is scary. It's very scary that there's some great technology out there that can help with this, but there's a lot of scenarios that nothing exists to stop that. There was another agency we talked to. They're very concerned with like folks prompting PII. But there's technology like through the browser or whatever where you control that, but a lot of agencies don't control the browsers of their contractors. So like you're in this catch-all, like, what do I do? And the answer was actually incredibly expensive, very reactionary. It doesn't actually solve the problem. So unfortunately, I don't think industry has all the answers right now. I think we're iterating and learning through this process, and that's how it's going to be for a bit until the AI just does it all.
The problem is that it's changing so quick, it's hard to even keep up with from a decision standpoint, right? You think that you're about to close that gap, and then a new thing is released, and it's like, well, let's throw this out, start over.
Yeah, what we have to hope, and back to the open source, this is why open source is scary for AI, that, and regardless of what the opinions on Anthropic are, that the recent security model they talked about, very dangerous in my opinion, but we can't have the attackers, the hackers, the nation states get those models. So we have to hope industry is going to keep those sort of models internal for defense, potentially for attack in our own national interests. But that is going to be critical. We have to be ahead of the attackers in the models they have. And that is really where industry is going to be leaning towards, is these proprietary models that are limited to a few to give us that advantage in the cyber battlefield.
So I think we have to assume that they're going to have access to either those models or the equivalent of. Yeah. And we need to prepare for the outcome of that.
Yep, we can't stop China from building those models.
So Keith, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll do audience questions. So there's mics on either side of the room. If you do have questions, start to line up, and we'll turn it over to you next. So Keith, in your opinion, what separates when we talk about some of these new technologies that are coming out, but also threats and the risks associated with adversaries getting those tools? What separates agencies that are successful in cybersecurity versus not?
I want to say the quick answer is funding, but I feel like that's not necessarily what you're shooting for. I think that from what I've seen over the last year, one of the largest hurdles is, even though we're all federal agencies, we don't all necessarily support each other equally. Mm-hmm. And I think that would be a tremendous value add to the government if, internal to HHS optives, CMS is rather large, right? But we have some smaller optives that don't necessarily have the staff, the technology stacks, the experience. And if we make it easier for us to be able to support them through this. So open source has come up a few times. Any software that my team is developing for use, we open source it because we want everyone to be able to use it. I don't think the agentic and AI is going to slow down open source. I think it's going to rapidly enhance it. I think it's going to change the market from a build versus buy perspective. I think building is going to become much more cheaper. And I think that's a good thing for the government because we can share that more easily. There's already requirements around us to be able to share technology code bases across the government for use. Mm-hmm. I think if there's one thing that I could change, it would be how we can support each other as federal entities as a whole, mm-hmm. and not put up walls between each of us.
Mm-hmm. Right. And any questions? I see maybe one. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tristan Boyd. I'm a student at George Mason here in Fairfax. I just had a question about, you all were talking about the role of open source software with AI. How do you think this will change? Because from my understanding in school, our teachers and professors talk about the importance of using open source to save money and get that value. But is the risk of open source and AI too great to do that?
I don't mind going. I don't think so. I think we should heavily utilize open source. I think we should encourage our own developers to use it, and we should open source our own code as much as possible.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, great, thank you.
And I'll append to your answer a little bit, and following up on your thread about collaboration across government is, how open source is the right answer. It is beneficial, it works well, right? There's transparency, but it's also trying to figure out how to get a, what do you call, a certified, dependency with a seal of approval. And how do you do that so that you're not reaching out to the dark web to get a package? That some authoritative website where we have scanned the dependency packages is where you're getting your dependency package. And how do you build that trust that says, if this dependency package is being used by, and this version of it has been used by this agency with this hash file, it's good to use with my product,
Gotcha.
right? So just keeping those things in mind, but the fact that even with open source packages, they change so fast. You could have, you know, hourly updates, you know. How do you manage that? And that's the risk consideration that you have to take as a developer, but being able to take a step back and say, where is a good place I can get a package open source package to do my job that is secure, authenticated, reliable, trustworthy.
Okay, great. So it's really about balancing that trust versus usability and making sure you're not using something that hasn't been validated.
Yeah, so you know, you don't go to, you know, a website that ends in RZ or, you know, or CN to download a package. That might be a good stop.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and the interesting dynamic there is like, yes, you don't go to CN to download, but if you look at the most successful open source projects like Kubernetes, the number one contributor is China. But that's the beauty of large open source projects that are successful is everyone is checking everyone. There's checks and balances there to make sure the open source software is up to date, isn't have a massive security hole. You just saw Kubernetes just deprecated their Nginx controller, which was huge because that's what everyone used by default, and there was a massive breach of that. And they made a decision as a community that we're not going to do that anymore. So I think it really depends on the popularity and the success of that open source project you're using versus finding some random little tool you want to use in your app because it solves some problem for you. And there's like one developer and one committer because we've seen breaches for those all the time. And people blame that developer, but it's more like, in some cases, millions of people are using that software because it solves a specific problem, but there's no money or security behind it. So it's an interesting dynamic. So I think I would recommend in general that when you're using open source, an industry should contribute to the ones that are successful in helping people. So it is secure and it is not leaving us at risk.
Gotcha. Thank you all for your insight.
Thank you.
And not sure if there's anyone else that had a question. Or you can go.
Not to
Sorry,
put
you can ask your second one.
Okay. Yeah, I just had one follow-up. So as a student that's, you know, I'm a senior this year, I'm getting ready to move into the workforce. You guys kind of talked earlier about, you know, how you're using AI to relieve some of the human load for your junior roles. How can we as students coming into the workforce make sure we're still providing value and avoid being replaced, you know?
I would say learn how to use AI. Come in off the bat with ideas. So I was at a job fair recently talking to recent grads, and the conversations I found most interesting were ones that were coming in and talking about their like capstone projects where they leveraged Claude or OpenAI to build these various things or perform these various tasks for them. Mm-hmm. I think you have a leg up on some of us that are chasing this, right? I came up through the IT ranks of help desk, learning all the various manual tasks. You should immediately be learning how to use these products to support your task for you.
Gotcha. Okay.
So one thing I'll say, I have 2 daughters in college right now, right? And what I'm seeing given from my daughters and the conversations we have is the entry-level positions are what are getting eliminated because AI can do a good enough job for an entry-level position. But the purpose of an entry-level position is to train you. You're not supposed to be proficient, right? So there's that dynamic. And what I would encourage you and maybe you know, your friends to do, if I was to leave one thought, is maybe get a more entrepreneurial spirit. Don't depend on your college to say, I need to find a, you know, internship somewhere, whatnot. Take a risk, build a product, see how it plays out, right? Learn how to engage with customers. Gotcha. And that is the number one thing that a machine won't be able to solve, is learning how to engage with customers, learning how to sell, learning not only how to sell your product, but to sell yourself. If you do that, you'll be fine. The folks that don't do that, that just wait for that internship that's never going to come, those are the folks that are going to get left behind.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can come talk to me after this. We'll chat. So I'm Dave Mascaroni. I'm CEO of Acquia Inc. Anil, you had an interesting point early on where you said essentially Moore's Law is now 7 months and not 2 years. So the question I have is really around AI policy, and specifically around security for AI policy. Given that it's moving so quickly, how are you all planning to address that? And then also there's an offshoot into like contracting, how contracts are being put out, and what you're requiring back from the GovCon community.
So what I'll say is it's such a evolving field that everybody doesn't have the answers, including industry, including my federal partners, including just our larger ecosystem of our procurement staff, whatnot. We're all learning together, right? But what we are learning is we can't spend a year working on a procurement. We need to be much faster and be able to take some enterprise risk, educated, deliberate enterprise risk. So, the adage I used to have from my days in the Army is, perfect is the enemy of good, right? So we need to have a good product, a shorter span of contract so we can manage the risk. So not talking about 5-year, the 2 base, 3 option period contracts, that world has sailed us by. You should be looking at 6-month firm fixed price sort of contracts, and folks that can respond to that, industry partners that can adapt to that are going to be much more successful with a 6-month cycle, firm fixed price, I'll do delivery and I'll move on, as opposed to transactional work based to 3 option period contracts.
All right, and I'm sorry, we ran out of time, but not to put you all on the spot. If you're hanging around, hunt us down. But thank you, panelists, for joining me today. It's been great to learn more about how you're using AI to combat cyber challenges, and I see Mike buttoning up, so I'll turn it back over to him for the next session. Thank you.